Coming up on New Day at Arirang, the WHO urges the international community to cancel year-end events to contain the spread of COVID-19. This comes as the highly transmissible Omicron variant has been detected in 45 states across the U.S., while it's behind the rapid increase in new infections in Britain. South Korea's producer prices again reached an all-time high in November, rising for a 13th month in a row. The Bank of Korea said that its producer price index last month was 112.99, up 0.5% from the previous month. And Hong Kong's Legislative Council election on Sunday saw its lowest ever turnout. Watchers say it's likely a show of dissatisfaction over mainland China's tightening grip over the territory.
Hello and welcome to this Tuesday edition of New Day at Arirang. It's 8 a.m. on December 21st here in Seoul, South Korea. Thank you for joining us today. I'm Mark Broom.
And I'm Kim Jong-un. Over the next hour, we'll take a look at the big news stories of the day and get expert insights on the issues facing Korea and the world. Now, we begin with the COVID-19 situation here in South Korea. As the virus continued to spread nationwide, hospitals are really feeling the strain due to the increase of patients, particularly those who are critically ill, amid the shortage of ICU beds.
Yes, for more on COVID-19 related updates, we have our reporter Kim Yeon-sung joining us in the studio. Morning, Yeon-sung.
Good morning.
So the government is doing what it can, at least, to try and alleviate some of the burden on an extremely exhausted medical staff here in South Korea. Tell us more about what they're trying to do.
Right, so before I get into that, let me just start off with explaining what it seems like out there. So it's quite a dire situation. Hospitals are barely keeping their heads above water with the influx of critically ill COVID-19 patients. Seoul National University, for example, is pivoting into an emergency system, and it's focusing on acquiring more ICU beds and treating critically ill patients. They're also postponing non-emergency spine, joint, brain, and heart surgeries because there's little room left in intensive care units. But this hospital isn't the only one forced to make this choice. I had a chance to talk to a medical frontline worker yesterday afternoon. Take a listen to what he said.
Hospitals in Seoul and Gyeonggi-do province are probably all going through a similar situation. We need ICU units to care for patients after surgery, but because there are no more units left, we can't perform surgeries.
The South Korean government has put down special orders to create extra breathing room for the struggling healthcare system. It's urging hospitals in the capital to transition into special COVID-19 care facilities and deploying army doctors and public health specialists to COVID-19 medical frontlines. But a medical expert says that these efforts won't cut it. According to this expert, the extra personnel being deployed are often not fit to care for critically ill patients, and the extra beds acquired are not nearly enough to accommodate not only the COVID-19 patients, but also the overflow of patients that tend to increase during the winter. Instead, this expert claims that the government needs to help in other ways.
There needs to be a computerized system that helps manage the patients' beds. There also needs to be more funding allocated to hospitals so that they can run the quarantining units.
Right. Well, keeping that in mind, Yeon-sung, where do we stand in terms of the latest COVID-19 tally?
Well, the numbers slightly shifted down from Sunday night's tally. Health authorities logged 4,239 new COVID-19 infections, up to 9 p.m. Monday, which is more than 650 cases fewer than the tally marked on the same time Sunday.
Okay, well, that seems perhaps it might be an anomaly, but it appears that to be going down a bit compared to last week anyway. Let's move on to vaccines. I hear there's a new study in the process of coming out on the horizon, so to speak.
Right, so Moderna revealed on Monday some promising results about their booster shots providing extra protection against the Omicron variant. Moderna said that the company's lab test showed that after a half-dose booster shot, the level of neutralizing antibodies that are able to fight against the Omicron strain jumped by 37 times. A half-dose booster is typically administered to most people, but a full-dose shot, usually given to people with a weakened immune system, showed even more promising results in antibody levels. A full dose triggered an 83-fold increase in antibody levels, but it did accompany extra risk in terms of vaccine side effects. It's important to note that these test results are just preliminary and have not yet gone through comprehensive scientific review. Also, antibody levels are just one indicator used to protect vaccine protection, but they do not speak for the entire efficacy and immune protection of the vaccines.
Right, and I just heard that Europe just paved the way for a new vaccine to battle the combat against increasing infections. Is that right?
Right. So the European Union actually gave the green light to Novavax's vaccines for people aged 18 and older. The European Medicines Agency, or the EMA, said that the vaccine showed 90% efficacy, while its protection against some variant strains, including Omicron, is still unclear. Yet Europe's health officials paved the way for the new vaccine in the region to encourage anyone who's not been vaccinated or boosted to battle the spiking COVID-19 infections. According to the EU, the two-dose vaccine from Novavax has passed the Commission's rigorous standards of efficacy, quality, and safety. Novavax from next January will start shipping up to 200 million doses to the EU's 27 member states.
Right, let's hope the vaccines could boost, protection in the region. Yeon-seung, again, thank you so much for your report. We'll talk to you again soon.
Moving on now, countries around the world are taking tighter antivirus measures due to fears over the rampant spread of the Omicron variant. This highly contagious strain has now been detected in 45 out of 50 states across the United States.
It's also driving the explosive increase in new COVID-19 cases in Great Britain. Our Kim Hyo-san reports.
Shortly after the top medical advisor at the White House said the Omicron variant is, quote, raging around the world, the Washington, D.C. state government declared a state of emergency. The city has reimposed its mask mandate until the end of next month. As of Monday, the variant has been confirmed in 45 U.S. states, with experts warning Omicron is expected to become the dominant strain in the coming weeks. In Europe, Germany has ruled out a Christmas lockdown, but plans to introduce tighter antivirus measures in the coming days. Local media outlets say the measures could include limiting private gatherings to 10 people and shutting indoor clubs and discos. It's also highly likely these measures, which will be put in place from December 28th, will include the government's renewed appeal to unvaccinated Germans to get their jabs and for everyone who is eligible to get a booster. The UK, where the completion rate of booster shots has exceeded 50%, is grappling with a steep rise in the number of new cases. Hit by the rapid spread of Omicron, the UK logged nearly 92,000 new cases on Monday alone. Prime Minister Boris Johnson warned the public of new virus controls due to fears the country's health services could be overwhelmed.
And unfortunately, I must say to people, we will have to reserve the possibility of taking further action to protect the public and to protect public health, to protect our NHS. And we won't hesitate to take that action.
In Israel, a clinical trial to test the effectiveness of a fourth COVID-19 vaccine shot will be launched in the coming days as the country fights the spread of Omicron. The research subjects will be 150 medical staff members who received their third shot by mid-August. This comes as the World Health Organization urges the international community to cancel events over the festive period.
But an event cancelled is better than a life cancelled. It's better to cancel now and celebrate later than to celebrate now and grieve later. None of us want to be here again in 12 months' time.
Speaking at a news conference in Geneva, he also called on global leaders and individuals to make, quote, difficult decisions to protect ourselves and others. Kim Hyo-san, Arirang News.
Despite rigorous campaigning, Hong Kong's Legislative Council election on Sunday saw its lowest ever turnout. Watchers say it's likely a show of dissatisfaction over mainland China's tightening grip over the territory. It's been 2 years since massive protests were held over Beijing's highly controversial national security law. Kim Ji-yeon has this report.
Hong Kong saw a record low voter turnout of 30.2% in its first Patriots-only legislative election, which was held on Sunday, renewing its previous record of around 44% in 2000. Various media outlets based in the West on Monday cited pundits saying it reflects a steep decline in civic and political engagement following China's overhaul of the island city's electoral processes. In response, China's foreign ministry, however, denies this or cites other external factors.
For one, there's the impact of the pandemic, and there's also the interference and sabotage by anti-China elements, rebellious forces in Hong Kong, and other external parties. This also precisely proves the importance and necessity of enacting and implementing the Hong Kong national security law and improving the electoral system of the Hong Kong Special Administrative Region.
Results show pro-establishment candidates claimed all 20 seats in the available geographic constituencies. Only 20 seats out of the expanded 90-seat legislature are directly elected by the public, the lowest number since Hong Kong was handed over from Britain to Chinese rule in 1997. The vote comes 2 years after pro-democracy anti-government protests were held against the introduction of a national security law that bans succession, subversion, and collusion with foreign forces. Kim Jong-un, Arirang News.
Now, in response to this, leading world powers have condemned Hong Kong's highly vetted legislature vote, saying the rules imposed by Beijing eroded democracy. The city held its first vote on Sunday after China imposed a national security law on Hong Kong. Only 30% of the electorate voted, the lowest since China assumed power almost a quarter of a century ago. In response, the G7 expressed its grave concerns over the erosion of democratic values. It also called for China to respect the fundamental rights and freedoms of Hong Kong. In an earlier statement, the U.S., Canada, Australia, and New Zealand rebuked the new system in even stronger rhetoric, saying the law has eliminated any meaningful political opposition.
Now it's time for On Point, where we speak to experts to delve deeper into the biggest news stories in the spotlight right now. North Korean leader Kim Jong-un recently marked his 10th year in power. A lot has changed in North Korea over the past decade, and his leadership, while arguably you could say touch and go at the start, has seemingly solidified in recent years. However, the North currently faces a myriad of challenges on almost every single front, not least a looming food crisis as we head into the most unforgiving period of the Korean Peninsula's notoriously frigid midwinter. On the international front, North Korea has been relatively quiet in terms of missile launches and such, and there have been no major provocations like an ICBM launch or nuclear tests in years now.
Perhaps taking the relative calm as their cue, China and Russia have teamed up, both permanent members of the UN Security Council, to try and press for a lifting of certain international sanctions imposed on North Korea. For more, we connect to Mark Barry, a North Korea expert and associate editor of the International Journal on World Peace. Good morning, Mark.
Good morning.
Now, why do you think Russia and China are pushing for the removal of sanctions on North Korea, considering the other members, the U.S., the UK, and France, would, never agree and all have veto-wielding power? What's the real motive behind Beijing and Moscow making this move that's, doomed to fail at this current time?
Well, from the point of view of Russia and China, they've been consistent over the last 30 years that the North Korean nuclear issue must be settled without confrontation. So they insist that North Korea has legitimate interests that must be respected, that the Kim regime should be treated as a partner for peace and not as an adversary. So you could say in hindsight that Russia and China are probably more right than wrong. And as both countries border on North Korea, they don't want to see regional instability in Northeast Asia. And by the way, of the five Security Council countries you mentioned, the United Kingdom has diplomatic relations with North Korea. But on the nuclear issue, they follow U.S. policy because non-proliferation alone, in my view, has taken on a higher value than resolving a state of war that has persisted since 1953.
Okay, so in your view then, do you think it is important that the international community maintains this kind of leverage it has, economically speaking, over North Korea through these sanctions to try and pressure the regime to meet its denuclearization commitments? And would you support, if it were to work, putting even tougher sanctions on the North to try and force their hand?
Well, I think that bilateral and UN sanctions in North Korea are maintained because in the end, the United States has relied on military power and pressure rather than astute diplomacy since the collapse of the Soviet Union 30 years ago this month. In a sense, classic diplomacy in conflict resolution, you might say, is now a rarity. So sanctions today in 2021 are a bargaining chip that the U.S. uses with North Korea. But I think there are three realities about sanctions on the North. Number one, the U.S., in the view of many experts, doesn't adequately enforce its own sanctions or UN sanctions. Secondly, China pays little heed to UN sanctions, except, of course, for it becoming much tougher during the fire and fury period of 2017. And thirdly, North Korea has found a multitude of ways to skirt sanctions. Ironically, as far as I understand it, the DPRK is not the most sanctioned nation around, but Iran is, followed by Russia. And moreover, North Korea has, in a sense, harmed itself far more in the last 2 years with its ironclad COVID lockdown than it has been hurt by U.S. and UN sanctions.
And Mark, let's focus more on the leader, Kim Jong-un. 10 years ago, at the age of 27, Kim Jong-un was North Korea's so-called, great successor. Fast forward to 2021, and the regime is in crisis, arguably poorer and possibly even more isolated than when he first took power. How do you assess Kim's decade as the leader of North Korea?
Well, it's interesting. I knew 3 Korean Americans who attended Kim Jong-il's funeral on December 28th, 2011. And they each personally expressed their condolences to Kim Jong-un. And I later got to see their photos of them with Kim. And Kim looked absolutely devastated, not only upon the death of his father, but I think at the sudden burden that had been thrust upon him at the young age of 27, with very little time to really ramp up and prepare. And many doubted that he'd make it beyond the first year or two, because successions are a fragile time for regimes that are dependent on a single absolute leader. So you could say Kim did what he thought he had to do to consolidate power, and none of the other leaders who accompanied the hearse at his father's funeral are either alive today or in power. So for the economy, Kim probably did more than he's been given credit for, and he did undertake bold initiatives with both President Moon and President Trump. But unfortunately today, Kim is still surrounded by the same old familiar problems.
Yeah, we remember that period of purges and executions that Kim went on in the early years of his reign. Perhaps if you'd taken a photo of the people who were friends with Kim Jong-il at that time, their face would have looked even more sad, considering they probably knew their fate at that point. But some experts say that Kim Jong-un is facing his toughest moment as leader yet. Got all these sanctions on the regime. There's the pandemic, of course, and what you labeled their own kind of shooting themselves in the foot in that regard. Then you got your food shortages and all the growing economic turmoil, and it's all coming together at once. Do you think that Kim and his top aides recognize something has to change, and very quickly, to ensure that he remains in such a powerful position in, say, another 10 years from now?
Yes, the existential question is, will the next 10 years be no better or even worse than the first 10? My own hunch is after the next South Korean president takes office, Kim will try to arrive at some kind of an accommodation with South Korea, because in my view, his only other choice may be a de facto Finlandization by China, in which China promises to greatly invest in the North's economy, but at the expense of North Korea's full independence and sovereignty. And Kim will never accede to that. So by accommodating with the South, Kim gains both political leverage against China and substantial economic support, theoretically, from South Korea. And if that occurs, the best U.S. response would be diplomatic recognition of North Korea after some kind of a tacit understanding about the ultimate disposition of the North's nuclear weapons program.
All right. Well, as always, Mark, thank you so much for making time and sharing your insights with us. We look forward to speaking to you again soon.
Okay, and happy holidays to both of you.
Thank you. South Korea's producer prices, a key barometer of future inflation, again reached an all-time high in November, rising for the 13th month in a row. The Bank of Korea said Tuesday that its producer price index last month was 112.99, up 0.5% from the previous month. Compared with the year earlier, the reading up 9.6%. That's the biggest jump since 2008. That was the height of the global financial crisis. The central bank attributed the rise to higher prices of industrial goods led by rising raw material and global oil prices. It was also driven by higher prices of agricultural goods and city gas. The South Korean government has unveiled its economic policy plans for 2022, with a strong finish expected this year. Officials say the plan is to maintain that momentum and hopefully make a full economic recovery in the new year. Kim Sang-min with the details.
Rebuilding the pandemic-hit economy and further extending growth momentum. That's how South Korea aims to guide its economy in 2022.
정부는 임기 마지막까지 성과를 더욱 발전시키고 부족한 부분을 채워나가는 데 온 힘을 다하겠습니다. 2022년 경제정책 방향에는 위기를 넘어 완전한 정상화를 이루겠다는 정부의 정책 의지를 담았습니다.
This will be done based on three-track system of measures. First is to reinforce its growth track by boosting consumption, investment, and exports. This involves encouraging consumption by extending tax deductions on spending in traditional markets and holding another round of nationwide sales events in May next year. Tax deductions will also be provided on investments for research and developments of strategic sectors like those of semiconductors and batteries. To maintain the country's outstanding growth in exports, the government will expand its export financing by up to $219 billion, up $4 billion from 2021. Efforts to join the global free trade agreement networks like Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership will also continue. Another pillar of the government's plan is helping those who were hit by the pandemic throughout 2021. This includes mostly small merchants whose business operations were restricted due to social distancing measures. The quarterly lower limit for compensation for small businesses will be increased from the current 100,000 Korean won to 500,000 won, or around $420. Overseeing inflation is also part of the government's efforts. From next year, each ministry will take responsibility for inflation in their own fields while reporting to the Finance Ministry. The last track is the management of risks from both internal and external factors. To reduce supply chain risks, the government will run a task force to oversee the supply of strategic materials. The rise of household debt will be controlled within a range of 4 to 5%. And stabilizing the housing market will be done by expanding the supply of houses. And based on all these steps, the government expects the country's economy to grow by 3.1% next year, which is on par with projections made by other institutions like the Asian Development Bank and slightly higher than the OECD's 3%. Inflation is expected to slow down at 2.2%. While South Korea's exports are forecast to grow further, increase in imports will pull the current account balance down to $80 billion. Kim Sang-min, Arirang News.
And now we cross over to our Oh Soo-young for a global insight and an in-depth look at important developments in world affairs.
Thank you, Mo-kyun. It is indeed time for Global Insight, where we speak to experts from around the world on issues making headlines. The US Congress approved a massive $777 billion defense budget for 2022, marking a 5% increase from last year. As America turns its focus to the Indo-Pacific region amid its rivalry with China, the bigger military budget will aim to prop up resources and new defense technologies, as well as better provide support for servicemen and women. We discussed some of the changes seen in the National Defense Authorization Act this year and what it means for countries in East Asia. For this, I'm joined by Joseph Bosco, former China Country Director for the US Secretary of Defense and opinion contributor to The Hill, and Professor Young-Jun Kim at the Korea National Defense University, who is also a member of the National Security Advisory Board to the South Korean President. Very warm welcome to you both. And well, let's start with you, Mr. Bosco. Now, the US Congress actually gave $25 billion more than Biden asked for in the defense spending plan for next year. The bill includes a $7.1 billion budget for the Pacific Deterrence Initiative, a statement of congressional support for the defense of Taiwan, as well as a ban on the US Department of Defense procuring items produced with forced labor from China's Xinjiang region. Now, what do you make of the changes in this year's NDAA, and do you think the increase in spending is justified?
Yes, thank you for having us. I believe it's not only justified, but it's a very positive and important development. It demonstrates first that there is no great difference between the Biden administration and the United States Congress on the kind of threat that is emerging in the Indo-Pacific. That's extremely important. And it's also important that it was bipartisan, that there is no difference between the Democratic Party and the Republican Party in the nature of that threat. So I think the increase in the defense budget is a very positive development, and it should send a message to China that the United States, at least on this issue, is quite united in opposing its activities and behavior in the Indo-Pacific.
Well, Professor Kim, we've seen countries like Russia, China and the US all ramping up their defense budgets, and recently they've been testing hypersonic missiles. Now, why are they all rushing to develop this technology? What is the strategic significance of this weapon?
Thank you for having me. In the three dimensions of the importance, especially technical level, current U.S. missile defense cannot defend the hypersonic missile system, especially Russia has created the Kinjal and Avant-Garde. And also, at strategic level, we can discuss about the deterrence issue as well. No deterrence means from this hypersonic missile system is very controversial. And finally, political, diplomatic level, we can discuss about the symbolization of useless of the current U.S. missile defense system. It will leave some kind of fear, like controversy in the U.S. military committee as well.
Well, Mr. Bosco, the Biden administration, of course, it's made a very strong shift to the Indo-Pacific region, but the new defense bill seems to indicate that Russia is still continuing to pose a threat along with Iran. Do you expect the threat from these countries to intensify?
Is that for me, Soo Young? Yes, I believe certainly in the short run, the pressures will intensify from both Russia and China. And there's even some indication that they are cooperating and coordinating their own moves in their respective regions and kind of catching the U.S. in a position where we have to respond to one threat on one side of the world and another threat on the other side. Whether or not there is actual coordination, certainly the effect of the two challenges in Ukraine and in Taiwan and the South China Sea are having that effect. And I think the United States will be able to respond. It's planning on responding to both threats, even simultaneously if necessary. It will not be an easy task, but it is essential to not only U.S. national security, but to international peace and stability.
And Mr. Bosco, well, Russia and China, they've been boosting their conventional and cyber capabilities, and also appearing to cooperate in space technology as well. How wide or narrow is the race when it comes to these new technologies between these countries and the United States? And how can the United States stay ahead of its competitors?
Well, it's quite a challenge technologically and financially and in other ways. But in a sense, one could argue that China and Russia are forcing the United States into an arms race. And we know that the last time there was an arms race was with the United States and the Soviet Union. It did not turn out well for the Soviet Union. Some people argue that President Ronald Reagan, in effect, forced the Soviets to spend themselves into oblivion. I hope that China and Russia don't force the United States to engage in that kind of an arms race. But if it does, I think they will find out that the U.S. has a very, very resilient economy and a very strong political situation that will deal with the challenges.
And Professor Kim, I want to hear your thoughts on the possibility of an arms race. Now, China has been deploying short and medium range ballistic missiles to counter US naval carrier groups in the disputed waters of the South China Sea and also around Korea and Japan. Do you think Washington and Beijing are going to be able to sit down and discuss arms control, or do you think there's going to be an arms race escalating in the region?
We need an arms control regime in this region more than any other region because of arms race situation in this region. But unfortunately, very less possibility for the arms control regime, including Japan, South Asia, South Korea, North Korea, China, and the U.S. and Russia, and more possibility for arms race issue because the level of trust between the country, also U.S. and China. The competition, and Donald Trump really wants to include China for new arms control regime in global wide, but China doesn't want to join because they didn't have a more nuclear warhead than the Russia and the U.S. as well. So this kind of the problem prevents us to make the new arms control regime in this region.
Oh, well, Mr. Bosco, there's been a lot of concern around Taiwan, with the Pentagon last month having raised concern about the possibility of China wanting to force Taiwan into unification or talks about unification by the end of this decade. And well, does the US right now have enough defense capabilities in the first island chain? How should it really counter China, which is very rapidly and aggressively militarizing?
Well, the United States is in the process of beefing up or augmenting its facilities and its assets in the region. So in the event there is that kind of crisis, the U.S. will be well prepared. But what is missing, I believe, Soo-young, is not necessarily U.S. capabilities, but a clear message of intention to defend Taiwan. I think that is what is missing. Strategic ambiguity is not helping the situation because it leaves the door open to China to believe that if they do attack Taiwan, the United States may not intervene and may sit back and let whatever is going to happen. That is to me, would be a major strategic miscalculation on China's part. And I think it's very important and incumbent on the United States to express its intentions quite clearly so that China does not make a fatal mistake.
Professor Kim, well, the National Defense Authorization Act this year, it omitted a clause that bans the reduction of American troops stationed here in South Korea. And some have interpreted this as the US keeping its options open to deploy its troops flexibly, perhaps elsewhere in the Indo-Pacific region amid its rivalry with China. What is your opinion on this?
We need to understand a little bit recent historical background of that bill. During the Trump administration, Trump wanted to reduce the U.S. troops, not just Korea, but in Germany, in worldwide for the American First policy. But that's why the U.S. Congress have to defend kind of the U.S. troops in the Korea. But during the Joe Biden administration, it was not necessary for keeping U.S. troops by partisan support. And also, U.S. China trade competition is uncertain. So U.S. Congress does not want to keep any kind of the status quo situation for more trade flexibility. So that's why a different background may lead a different bill.
And also Professor Kim, now former commander of the US Forces Korea, Robert Abrams, he indicated that the OPCON transfer won't happen until 2028 at the earliest. And the second stage of assessing the full operational capability of the ROK US Combined Forces Command is expected to take place next August. What is the reason that the process is taking so long?
Because of the different background, the early 2000, we remember the U.S. Bush administration wanted more strategic flexibility for U.S. forces worldwide. Their Lawrenceburg Doctrine, and they have also Iraq War at the time in Middle East and Afghanistan. But now the China issue is a problem for the U.S. So the U.S. administration does not want to open transfer. That's the most important issue. So there's a need to control power for USFK for uncertain situation, including Taiwan or Southeast Asia. So the U.S. administration doesn't want open transfer and different situation from the early 20s during the Nomuyan administration. So we need to understand this kind of different situation, and we need to keep the update of the U.S. strategy in this region.
Oh, Mr. Bosco, over the past few years, there has been a lot of questions lingering around the issue of U.S. troops being deployed around the world and how flexible they might be, the dispatchment may be in accordance with the U.S.'s defense strategy. Do you see the possibility of U.S. troops in Korea being deployed elsewhere as the rivalry between Washington and Beijing intensifies?
I think there have been encouraging signals in the last several months that our allies, Japan and South Korea and other countries in the region and even in Europe, are well aware of the increasing danger from China's military expansion and from its very aggressive rhetoric and very aggressive policies. So I think the possibility of greater collaboration between Australia, the UK, France, Japan is high, and I think that China needs to take that into its calculations. One of the benefits of the increase in the defense expenditures is that it shows the United States is putting its money where its policies are. And so it's setting an example for our allies in the region and elsewhere to beef up their own defense spending and to send assets to the region to help combat the Chinese communist threat, which endangers the international peace and security for everyone in the region, and particularly through the South China Sea with its vital commercial sea lanes.
And also, Mr. Bosco, there's been quite some debate over whether the Biden administration is going to specify a no first use policy in its upcoming nuclear posture review. What do you expect to see in the review next year?
I do not. I believe there are solid reasons why the U.S. has not declared that kind of policy, and I think those reasons will continue to prevail. And I think the sentiment in the defense community and in the Congress, as well as in the executive branch, will probably keep the status quo as far as that policy.
I see. Well, this is all we have time for today. That was Joseph Bosco, former China Country Director for the US Secretary of Defense and opinion contributor to The Hill, and Professor Yongjun Kim at the Korea National Defense University, also a member of the National Security Advisory Board to the South Korean President, joining us on the phone today. Thank you both so much for your time.
Thank you very much for having me.
The world's two superpowers, the United States and China, are aiming to rebuild their pandemic-hit economies in different ways. While the U.S. is trying to fight inflation through higher interest rates, China is hoping to boost exports to give its economy a shot in the arm. Kim Do-yeon with the details.
The two biggest economies in the world are moving towards opposite monetary policies to tackle the fallout of the pandemic. While the U.S. is making moves to start raising interest rates from near zero to tackle its strongest inflation in 4 decades, China is stepping up support for an economy under strain from a property market crackdown. In fact, on Monday, China cut its lending benchmark loan prime rate for the first time in 20 months by 5 basis points to 3.80%, while the 5-year LPR remained at 4.65%.
As the U.S. is going from a good state to overheated state right now, it is appropriate for the U.S. to raise interest rates. But China is a bit different. China's current COVID-19 policy is probably the biggest aspect, and then China has to export the other countries as well as the United States, leading to a slowdown in the economy.
Experts agree that the current trend, while mostly driven by what's happening domestically, will allow China's economy to bounce back with higher exports. Until recently, the trade war between the two countries had heavily impacted China's economy, but with the two countries' different policies coming simultaneously, US dollars will show strength while Chinese yuan will be cheaper, helping China's exports. As for other countries, higher interest rates will likely be followed.
Since most other countries have liberalized their capital when the U.S. raises interest rates, Europe and other countries in other parts of the world have to raise interest rates accordingly. Although there's a difference in speed, there are not many countries that have not liberalized their capital.
Experts also say that with China and the U.S. balancing out their own policies, it could actually help the global economy bounce back from the pandemic. Kim Do-yeon, Arirang News.
The World Economic Forum's annual meeting in Davos, Switzerland, has been postponed for the second straight year. According to a statement Monday, the meeting has been rescheduled for early summer next year due to continued uncertainty over the Omicron variant. The scaled-down forum was originally planned to take place next month. The statement said the transmissibility of Omicron and its impact on travel and mobility have made deferral necessary despite stringent health protocols. The previous forum was postponed and rescheduled for August 2021 in Singapore, but was subsequently canceled.
The Environmental Protection Agency has issued the toughest emissions standards for vehicle emissions requirements through 2026, potentially speeding a U.S. shift to electric vehicles, calling them the most ambitious standards ever set in the U.S. The EPA says emission standards for cars and light trucks will be tightened to 23.4 kilometers a litre. This replaces the looser Trump-era standards. The EPA forecasts it will save consumers money and prevent billions of tons of carbon emissions a year. The 2023 to 2026 standards will increase by 5 to 10% each year before reaching the target by 2026. Since October, the city of Seoul has been working with the police to prevent accidents and crime through a new neighborhood night patrol program. The city says that in its first 2 months, the patrols have handled 160 cases, which include helping women and senior citizens get home safe, helping intoxicated people who've passed out on the street, and reporting fires and broken streetlights. The program currently covers 15 areas where there are high concentrations of people living alone. The patrols are out from 9 p.m. until 2 a.m. every night.
Let's take a look at what's going on in the world now. Just 10 years after leading student protests demanding better education for his country, 35-year-old Gabriel Boric is now set to become Chile's youngest ever president. This comes as the former law student defeated far-right rival Jose Antonio Cast in the country's presidential runoff on Sunday, with over 55% of votes compared to cast 44%. During his victory speech, Boric stressed that he will become a leader for the everyday people in his country.
I know that in the coming years the future of our country is at stake, so I guarantee that I will be a president who cares for democracy and does not risk it, listens more than he speaks, seeks unity and attends to the needs of the people daily. I will firmly fight against the privileges of the few, and I will work every day for the quality of the Chilean family.
After leading student protests in 2011, he joined the National Congress as a lower house lawmaker in 2014. In an open letter on Saturday before being elected the country's next leader, he wrote that his government would make the changes Chileans had demanded in the 2019's social uprising. The movement then, which lasted months, sparked a formal process to redraft Chile's decades-old constitution, a text that will face a referendum next year. Germany's new Prime Minister Olaf Scholz on Monday met with his Italian counterpart Mario Draghi in Rome. During the talks, the two leaders looked to narrow their differences over EU fiscal rules.
I think there will be a narrowing of positions on the Stability Pact. There are many considerations that are quite immediate. The pandemic and the post-pandemic call on all our countries to finance unprecedented projects.
Some of the projects include in the field of environmental transition, digital transition, defense, and coordination. Known as the Stability and Growth Pact, the EU launched a review of its fiscal rulebook in October to better reflect the new post-COVID-19 reality of higher public debt and the massive costs of transitioning to a carbon-neutral economy. Such fiscal rules have since become a major source of tension between member states. The UK's Vodafone is set to auction the first text message ever sent as an NFT. The message, which reads "Merry Christmas," was first sent on December 3, 1992, and will be auctioned off online on Tuesday through a French auction house.
In France, it is forbidden to sell intangible goods, so we gave tangible form to this first text message with this digital frame, which displays the code, the protocol used to send the first text message.
The text message was sent by Neil Papworth, an engineer for Vodafone, who sent the message to a Vodafone manager in the UK. The winner of the auction will also receive the replica of the original communication protocol that transmitted the text message, while the proceeds will go to the UN Refugee Agency. Lee Seung-jae, Arirang News.
Good morning. Nothing much to complain about in regard to the cold wave, but it's the dust again that covers many parts of Korea, including here in Seoul again. Especially those in central inland areas will need to drive with extra care as fog and dust are blocking visibility this morning. Westerly winds continue to make things quite dry on the East Coast, but a dry weather advisory still remains in place, so please be careful with anything that could start a fire. Morning temperatures are 2 to 6 degrees higher than the same time yesterday, and it should get sunnier as the day goes on. Gyeongju and Daegu are having a low of 1 degree Celsius. Highs in the upper regions will be a couple of degrees lower this afternoon, while southern provinces will be warmer, going up to 14 degrees in Daegu, Gyeongju, and Gwangju this afternoon. Then, get ready for a bone-chilling Christmas this year. Sunday looks to be even colder with a low of minus 13 degrees Celsius here in the capital. Meanwhile, east of Gangwon-do and Jeju Island could have a white Christmas this year. With that, here's a look at the weather conditions around the world.
And that's all we have for now. We'll be back at 8 a.m. Korea time on Wednesday for our next edition of New Day at Arirang. We appreciate you tuning in. I'm Kim Mo-gyan.
And I'm Mark Broom. Thank you for joining us. We will see you at 8 a.m. tomorrow. Until then, goodbye.